bell did ring, okay. I have to use a microphone for the live stream. All right. Is this working? All right, cool. Yeah, you can all hear me. I'm usually pretty loud. This is not for you. This is for the other people that aren't here. So hello, and welcome to the Rose-Hulman Cybersecurity Seminar. I'm Dr. Sid Stam. Many of you know me. I teach cybersecurity and computer science stuff here. Today I have the distinct pleasure to introduce our cybersecurity seminar speaker, Dr. Eugene H. Spafford. Dr. Spafford is an author, a journal editor, an executive director emeritus of Purdue's Cybersecurity Center, a professor of CS, philosophy, communication, ECE, and political science. I had to write this down because there's so many things. He's a fellow of the ISC2, ISSA, ACM, IEEE, American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It's a lot of places. He's been given so many awards that I don't have time to list all of them here. He's been recognized by his home institution, Purdue, 1 million times, and earned, well, that's hyperbole, and earned more than one Lifetime Achievement Award. So does that mean you're not on your first life?
Not first human.
First human life. Okay, cool, very cool. He's also been recognized for his contributions to a wide variety of companies, law enforcement agencies, and government agencies, including, here's a short list, U.S. Air Force, multiple national labs, the NSA, GAO, FBI, NSF, DOJ, DOE, and more. Insert 3-letter abbreviation here. I first encountered Dr. Spafford, or Spaff as he signs his emails to me, in late 2004, 20 years ago, when he gave a talk at Indiana University about his grand challenges in trustworthy computing. His talk made a great impression on me and charged me with strong direction for my research. In his talk, he said, quote, "Security is not about circling the wagons, it's about getting over the mountains safely." This changed my perspective on security research. Security should be an enabler, not a disabler. Security is a requirement, not an optional feature, and everybody can be part of securing systems. And it just took his concise explanation to show me this 20 years ago. In August, Spaff reflected on his peers who were retiring and wrote, quote, "Many people have been asking me when I am retiring. My answer has been that as long as I enjoy what I'm doing, have the energy and memory to do it, and the administrative BS doesn't become too significant, I will keep at it." He continued, "Some people appear relieved. However, the more often they need to interact with me, the more disappointed they appear, with some Purdue colleagues quite crestfallen. The fall semester is rapidly approaching, and I look forward to molding yet another set of young minds. After all, don't we need more moldy minds? Enjoy what remains of your summer, for too soon you may have to encounter me again," end quote. We are fortunate enough to have such an encounter today. So please help me welcome Professor Spafford.
Well, thank you very much. And let me start by saying I was not part of a bait and switch. If you came here for cookies and got me instead, I apologize. I had no part in advertising.
We ordered them, they did not come.
So my talk today is intended to not make a particular point, but to be a little bit provocative, to give you a little bit of background and some views that I've developed over time. As Sid mentioned, I've been doing this for a while. I wrote my first program 52 years ago, which is still kind of mind-boggling for me. I've been working in security in some form for over 40 years, 37 of those years at Purdue, and I last spoke here at Rose-Hulman 30 years ago. So for several of you in the audience, actually I suspect for a few of you that I may have been writing programs since before your parents were born. It has been quite a journey, and the field has developed quite a bit. So I'm going to share with you some personal perspective. I'm not going to claim that a lot of this is based in solid experimentation or science. But part of this is that I want to convey to you that security and some of the concerns we have are not simply a new manifestation of issues, but something that's been going on for a while. Let me start by making the observation that I will assume that the majority of us here are humans. And as a scientist, without performing some experimentation, I wouldn't be able to claim that that was 100% of us. but let's say that the majority of us are. What defines us as humans? What are characteristics that would allow us to distinguish ourselves from other life forms? And talking with people who are involved in sociology, in biology, and other fields, 4 kind of characteristics come forward. First is our ability to reason about abstract and complex issues. We're able to take into account observations and think about situations that don't necessarily exist, but we're able to reason about them. We have a sense of time. We know something about the past, and we can conjecture there is a future. And that's not something that every species has shown evidence of. We can communicate with each other, and communicate not only in real time, but over time, asynchronously. And again, there are many species that communicate with each other, but that ability to communicate over time abstractly is a human characteristic. And we have developed tools. We are a tool-using species. Again, not the only one. All 4 of these characteristics have been evidenced in some other species, but the combination of the 4 appears to be unique for us as humans. And we develop those tools to try to augment some of those capabilities, to augment our communications ability or our sense of time or our ability to reason. Communication, as one of those fundamental skills, appears to have originated in our species as something perhaps about 100,000 years ago. And here I'm referring to mostly verbal communication rather than just threatening somebody with a club. But our evolution to develop the ability to speak appears to have emerged probably about 100,000 years ago. That's best evidence we've been able to come up with. Our ability to reason and our awareness of time probably came about around the same time. May have been earlier, but then it would have been individuals just with their own, trapped with their own thoughts and observations. Our archaeological record of civilization is currently goes back about 12 to 15,000 years, but likely goes back longer than that. There are some paradoxical finds that have been located recently that appear to suggest that maybe civilization and communication, written communication, go back farther, but probably not more than twice that amount of time. Our first written communication that we have been able to document well occurred about 5,000 years ago. So we had civilization of some forms that were going on for about 10,000 years before we developed written records. And again, the archaeological record here is not necessarily complete. There may be some items that we haven't found. Movable type, as you probably know from studies or otherwise, first was apparently invented in China in about the year 1040 AD, and then was rediscovered by Gutenberg in Europe in 1450. So much more recent. We've been able to communicate inscribing on papyrus and in stone tablets or clay tablets for many thousands of years, and the idea of movable type and printing considerably more recent. So really we've only got about 1,500 years of history of doing that. But literacy and written communication are still not universal. We still have many places in the world where people do not have a written language or do not know how to read and write. They are communicating, they're part of civilization, but we're not yet to the point where the whole of humanity has access to an ability to use some written communication. But oral communication certainly is a common phenomena. And if we look at tools, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but A notable one was the development of the telegraph in 1833. So the telegraph was intended not as an oral, but as a means of communication, taking thoughts and expressing them. Became an oral communication mechanism in the 1850s when the telegraph was evolved into the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell came along in 1875. He did not invent the telephone. He was the one who got the patent in the US for the telephone, but the telephone itself was invented prior to that. Without going through all of the development of that, let's sort of fast forward to where we are now. We have more phones of some kind than we do people. There are more telephones in the world than there are people. There are more cell phones in the world than there are people. Maybe some of you have 2 cell phones or know people with 2 cell phones. But we have more phones than people. There are, by best estimates, about 8.6 billion cell phones on the planet and about 8 billion people. And there's an additional 1 billion landlines. So cell phones far outnumber landlines. But this is all for communication. Those are designed for people primarily to speak with voice, although the majority now also allow various kinds of text communication or otherwise. So communication, very basic driving need for us. And that's been enabled in large part, by what advances in computing we've had. Most of those cell phones have computers intrinsic to what they do, built in. Several cell phone brands actually have multiple computing engines in them. So there's an awful lot of these. The idea of a computer, of a device to aid us in reasoning, is ancient. It goes back a very long time, and you've probably seen pictures of, if not actually used, an abacus. But early reckoning on clay tablets, we found mathematical tables, we found tools, we found descriptions of various kinds of things for people to do calculations. Goes back a very, very long time. The modern computer, the digital computer that we are familiar with in some form, was developed in the 1940s. And it was an outgrowth both of advances in technology and the pressures of World War II, because the development of the computer was driven both by code breaking in England and was being used as a ballistics calculator for artillery in the US. And so that was a major step forward for the development of the digital computer. After World War II ended, people looked at this and thought, well, this can be used for other things, and they performed experiments and developments. And in 1947, the transistor was invented at Bell Labs. And it took a few years, not very long, by looking at the history of technology and humanity, but transistors began to be commercially used in various devices. And in 1951, we had the first commercial computer of any kind, not necessarily a transistor, but the first commercial computer was in 1951, and that was made by a company called UNIVAC. Some of you may have heard of UNIVAC. The first all-transistor computer was the GE210, and that was in 1959. It was a gamble in the market. In 1958, IBM sort of got a leap on GE by announcing the 7070 in 1958, but it didn't come to market until late 1959. The GE was first. Now, for those of you who sort of paying attention, UNIVAC and GE don't make computers anymore. This is, by the way, a takeaway for computing in general. A lot of companies that used to make computers got out of the business or were acquired or just were not successful. And there's a long list of them. Xerox is one that actually made computers, some good ones for a while. Data General, Sun Microsystems, Digital Equipment Corporation, others. And therefore, one of the things, particularly for those of you who are a little bit younger, is don't bet on any existing company still being around in 20 to 25 years, because the history indicates that they don't last that long. You may find it difficult to think about what would the world be like without Microsoft or Dell or Apple, but that's a non-zero probability as things develop going forward. In 1965, we saw the first computer-to-computer network. In 1969, we saw the ARPANET be deployed. And in 1993, we saw the first modern Ethernet kind of connections. So now we're into a time period that's a lot closer for some of you. When I talk about computing back in being introduced in the 1950s, many of you are thinking, oh, that's ancient history. Well, to some of us, it's not. But the idea of networking is really very, very relative. Computer science as a degree-granting academic discipline started in October of 1962. The first degree-granting program in computer science was announced at Purdue University in October of 1962. And you think, for some of you, 1962, gee, that's a long time ago. That's over 60 years ago. But if you compare that to mathematics, physics, civil engineering, medicine, any other kind of established discipline, it is a very young discipline. And I'll mention there was a very notable software engineer named Harlan Mills, and I had some discussions with him many years ago and was talking about the quality of code that we were facing. And he said, well, you have to remember that computer science as a discipline, software engineering as a discipline, is currently where civil engineering was before they had invented the right triangle. It's a very young field. So in that regard, we shouldn't be surprised that we don't have answers to many things, that we're still learning. Computing today, going from that modest development in the 1940s as digital computers to today, is a joint effort of materials processing, electrical computing engineers, computer scientists, and others. Every year, tens of quintillions of transistors are manufactured. Now, they're not, the majority of those are not individual transistors. They're done wafer scale integration. But tens of quintillions, that's a huge number. How huge? There's 16 zeros in that. It is 7 more zeros than a billion. It's a lot of transistors every year. And the number has been increasing every year for decades. Currently, out of that about 8 billion people on the planet, approximately 5.3 billion of them have access to the internet. 5.3 billion, that's a lot. Now, when you're on the internet, you may think that you've got 100 friends or connections and that's a lot. But worldwide, it's effectively zero. And the growth in the number of people who've been online has been growing at a rate of 600% per year for about the last decade. That can't continue, obviously, because we do have an upper limit as to the number of people who have access. But we're starting to add other entities to the internet. So there have been experiments, for instance, where gorillas have been given access to the internet, where we have AI given access, and some art projects, I guess, where we've had dogs and cats who've been able to manipulate various kinds of I/O devices. I don't think that's going to be a big growth market, but nonetheless, it is a lot of people. We have currently about 2.7 billion desktop computers in use and 15 billion mobile devices. Okay, that 15 billion includes the 8.6 billion cell phones, but almost twice as many mobile devices. Where are those mobile devices? Your automobile, your watch, your camera, other kinds of medical devices. There are a lot of other mobile Internet of Thing devices. And that's growing at a huge rate. These are really big numbers. But they pale in comparison. Well, I should say, it took 27 years to get to 1 billion, 7 years to 2 billion, and now, after that, another 20 years where we're up to over 15 billion devices. But for large numbers, these numbers astonish me to look at this. Currently online, we have online running 64 zettabytes of data storage. Now, zettabyte is probably not a number that you've thrown around very often. That has 21 zeros in it. That's a lot of data. We have yottabytes of network traffic every year. A yottabyte is bigger than a zettabyte, 24 zeros. How much of that is spam and cat videos, I don't know, but a non-trivial amount. But think about going from communication, stone tablets, writing on papyrus, to the point where we're talking yottabytes of information that are transiting our networks and increasing. It's doubling approximately every 2 years. So that's an exponential growth, and no limit is currently seen as likely going to be in the next couple of years for that. So that's just to give you a picture of how rapidly this field has changed. And there are really no parallels in technology for how computing has both advanced and impacted our society. And that's the backdrop for cybersecurity, because that's where we have this pressing need. But the growth has been so explosive, it has outpaced our ability to understand and control a lot of that traffic and storage and computation. So let me visit this from a slightly different way, which is thinking about our computing environments. 40 years ago, which is about when I started working in cybersecurity, and that's a little more than a human generation. Sociologists that I've talked to say a human generation is 30 years. That's what they use for their calculations. So a little bit more than that. 40 years ago, both the PC and the Mac were brand new. Those had just recently been introduced. They're not that old. That technology is relatively recent. So going back 40 years, so that's right, 1984, there was only one known computer virus in existence in the world. Just one. Local area networks were new. They were just being tried out. We didn't have much there. There was no commercial use of networks at that point. It was all just research, largely mainframes. The power users, that is the people who actually knew how to use these systems for anything meaningful, could be numbered in, at most, the tens of thousands. That's it, worldwide. It's not a lot of people, not compared to that 5.3 billion who are currently using the internet. Most of the equipment we were using was made by companies that don't make computers anymore. So Digital Equipment Corporation, VMS, was one of the major systems. AT&T's Unix was, we still use Unix, but AT&T doesn't make those systems anymore. IBM mainframes. Okay, so that's like 20 years ago. 20 years ago was the first commercial use of the network. So think about that for many of you here. There are a couple of you here, maybe about 20, many who are a little bit older than 20. But going back that far, there was no commercial use of the internet. You couldn't buy anything. You couldn't watch a movie online. You couldn't sell things over the internet. It didn't exist. There was no Amazon. There was no eBay at all. And in 20 years, we've gone from there to our current environment of untold billions of dollars of commerce. 20 years ago, we had 3.3 million registered hosts in 10 countries. That was the worldwide internet back then, 10 countries. Now we're available in every country in the world, the space station, Even the Mars rover is connected to the internet. Don't try to connect to it because it's firewalled, but it is connected. The first spam message was sent 20 years ago. For those of you who are interested in the history, it was a legal duo by the name of Cantor and Siegel. It was a husband and wife team who were conducting a green card scam online for the network at the time. We had the first banner ads. There was no Twitter, there was no Google, there was no Amazon, but that was the computing. The most common protocol online was FTP, which probably many of you have never used, or at least not knowingly used FTP. The World Wide Web at this point had become the second most used protocol, barely. The third most common protocol was a protocol called Gopher. There are still some Gopher servers on the network, and the Gopher protocol is still registered. For those of you who are interested, you can do a search on Gopher. The World Wide Web was actually released in 1991 as a protocol. So this is the environment of the time back then. Now, if we look at our computing today, and we think about where we're going, why are we seeing this explosion in computing? Well, it's because there are so many ways that it enables us to do some of those human-centric activities, like communication and reasoning. If we look at that broad swath of things, it reveals to us why, in part, security is so difficult, is because we're supporting so many capabilities. We are seeing things in education, particularly personally tailored communication and education, where people can take courses online or look up references or read material online. We're looking at the preservation and delivery of documents. So we are scanning in old documents to store them, to preserve them, because the paper that they were written on or produced on is fragile and may not last another 100 years. But we're also doing that with movies. So archives of movies that were produced, the old celluloid that it was produced on is very flammable. And so several of those, there's an ongoing effort to digitize those and make them unavailable as a preservation mechanism. Not simply as a delivery and archival aspect. We are seeing a richness in communication develop as we're developing more now with virtual reality kinds of activities, where we're seeing haptic feedback, which means physical feedback of things that we're doing. All of that is an element that is growing and people are interested in. Entertainment, obviously, right? Music, movies, social media. Those are all things that we partake of on a regular basis. Even if you're watching legacy television rather than something on your laptop or your home computer, that is driven by computation. It is serving up digital signals off of a computer storage. It is scheduling that computer storage, delivering it over networks that are controlled by computers. We would effectively, if computing stopped, we would go dark in terms of our entertainment. Process control, being able to manage factories, being able to manage transportation systems, power delivery, utilities, and others over a long distance, and management of large enterprises. Rose-Hulman is not a huge school. It's a good-sized school. But you would not be able to function without computers. I'm not talking about classes. I'm talking about your registrations, your financial aid, the other kinds of, this building. The climate is controlled by embedded computer systems that you don't see. They are ubiquitous in our ability to manage any kind of infrastructure or organization. We're also using it for issues of law enforcement, national security, being able to monitor, for instance, in various spaces, hooking up things like closed-circuit TVs or other TV cameras. I don't know how many of you may have something like a Ring doorbell or a Nest thermostat or other. That penetration of what we monitor and what we observe for purposes of whether it's economics, law enforcement, or in some cases environmental preservation, again, is a major growing force. Add to this now the dawning of AI and ML, of artificial intelligence, machine learning, that is taking all of that data and all of those applications and digesting it to try to come up with yet new uses and new data, new applications. It is a very complex environment that we are trying to control in some ways, because that's security is not circling the wagons, but getting over the mountain safely, is trying to have some controls so that it can be used safely to advance those kind of human goals. It used to be, up until probably about 1960 or so, maybe a little later, that information generated by human beings was generated for other humans. When we wrote things up, it was for other humans to read. And that information was used largely for delayed communication and for record keeping, history. We are now to the point where the majority, by far, of all data that's produced is never seen by a human being. It's being used by other computers to make decisions. And that data may or may not be kept, which is an interesting challenge in and of itself, where we're trying to determine why things are done. But the majority of that information is never seen by a human, and it is being acted on often in close to real time to make decisions. What's controlling the HVAC in this building is monitoring and reacting in real time that, for instance, in this room, the temperature went up because a number of people came in, and depending on how the sensors were tuned and the programming, increased the air conditioning in here to even out the temperature. No human being was involved in that. We are now to the point where we are collecting big data, where we are trying to collect all of that information to understand things that we might not otherwise observe by looking at vast amounts of it with algorithms to try to do better prediction or better analysis. One of the first places this showed up was in the area of automated trading. That, for any of you who may have interest in things like the stock market or the bond market, you may execute some trade orders yourself, but the majority of the trading that goes on is all automated. It's all being done, programs selling and buying with other programs. No people are involved at all. And huge amounts of money are made for the owners of the computers in those algorithms by shaving milliseconds off. Companies willing to pay tens of millions of dollars to be able to move their data center 100 feet closer to the trading floor because the time of transit for the communication across the fiber optic from their computers to the trading computers is that much of an advantage for the machine trading. It's really difficult to believe. All of this is dependent on correctness, access by authorized parties when needed, and not available by unauthorized parties, and that it is available when needed. That is, that we don't have a denial of service. It is extremely dependent upon those characteristics. What I was just saying about trading, for instance, if you were able to delay that signal by a half a second, it could ruin companies. Half a second. Because we have become so dependent upon the functioning, the correctness, the expectation of what these systems do. Now, in the very early days of computing, back when we were in sort of the era of the mainframe, the big issue that we were concerned about was confidentiality. That is, information was only visible to those parties who were supposed to see it. And this was largely driven by government because government was one of the original movers in computing. I mentioned the idea of cryptography and ballistics. I mean, those are defense-oriented solutions, and that's where a lot of this occurred. The concern for decades was that we protect important information from being seen by adversaries. So confidentiality and all that that entailed, including encryption and access control, was largely driven by that need. The second major customer was in the finance industry. They also were concerned about confidentiality, but they introduced some other kinds of issues that were important for finance. Correctness certainly was part of that, but integrity, that is, that the information wasn't modified by, in an unauthorized way, availability, authenticity, identity, timeliness, and a number of other factors. If you study in software engineering, these are called non-functional requirements that you can't necessarily define an algorithm or something that provides that quality, but you have to support it in the design. All of that has grown up, and it's grown up in this environment where we need it today. We needed it yesterday, but we don't know how to do it. We do not have a uniform definition of what cybersecurity is. And those factors that I just talked about, for many of them, we don't have a measure. We don't have a metric to tell us how confidential something is or what the level of integrity is. We can sort of measure availability, sort of, or timeliness, but in general, we have no single good metrics for security because we still don't completely define what those are. Think about that. We're running the global economy on computing. All of these billions of people are involved in yottabytes of traffic, and we don't agree on what it is we're doing. It makes it a very challenging arena. And by the way, that does not mean if you're taking a class from Professor Stam, you can say he doesn't know what he's doing. That's a different issue, and I'm not going to address that in the talk. But you also here have some very interesting work going on in process control in ICS systems. And that's an important area in computing as well because we're using that in factories and buildings and other places. And we're seeing 1,000-fold increase per year in the number of sensors and actuators that are being connected online for building stress, health monitoring, environmental monitoring, and so on. And we're putting these sensors in more places to collect information. So for many of you, if you have a smartwatch, it may be measuring your body temperature, your pulse rate, your heart rate, other kinds of things that are then fed into algorithms that inform you or possibly alert you to problems. That's yet more data that we have to worry about being shared. And to whom it's being shared or to whom it's available, and how to prevent it from being used against us in some way. So that somebody gets in and alters the monitoring of your pulse rate, for instance, and alerts medical personnel because your heart rate has gotten too fast or too slow. Not actually, but that's what the sensor's reporting. It's even more important than that when we start looking, we're embedding sensors and medical devices. Pacemakers to regulate heart rhythm. Electric shock devices to help prevent or reduce the severity of various kinds of seizures. Insulin pumps that are intended to help people with diabetes. All of these have computers built into them. And because they need to be monitored by medical personnel and occasionally adjusted, they also have connectivity. It's not a good thing if somebody hacks into your pacemaker and dials it up, or hacks into your diabetes insulin pump and cranks that up. But many of the vendors that have produced these have been thinking, aha, I can solve a problem by having a computer device hooked up as a health technology, but they haven't thought about the potential abuses because security is not ubiquitous yet. We haven't given that enough thought. The data that's out there has errors, and it's hard to correct those. I've lived at several addresses over my lifespan, and it's interesting to find databases that have records of some of those addresses going back 40 or 50 years, including at least one that's erroneous that I just can't seem to get out of the records. And in part, this is because this rise of machine learning and AI, data has become a currency. Organizations do not want to delete old data, even if it was collected for other purposes that are out of date, because it may have a use. I talked to people at a couple major cloud providers and internet commerce companies, and they do not clean old data out of their databases. If they hit the limit on storage, it's cheaper for them to buy more disk than it is to pay people to eliminate the old data. Old erroneous data continues to stay around, including data that we don't necessarily want to share, but now becomes part of these data stores. Some of you who are students here now are in a time where you can't get away from your past as easily. When you publish those photos or those recollections online, or my comments about my class, it isn't a matter that the people who saw them may not remember them in a year or 5 years. The fact is, they're stored out there somewhere, and people can find those, possibly to your detriment. Well, why? There's the apocryphal question to Willie Sutton, who is a famous bank robber, about why do you rob banks? And his alleged answer, which does not appear to actually have happened, was, I rob banks because that's where the money is. Data and computing is the new currency. And that's where the value is. That's why we're seeing all this explosion in things like blockchain and AI, is because people believe there's money to be made there in manipulating the data. Thieves are interested in this. National operatives who are involved with military or intelligence. Industrial competitors are very interested in this data because it may give them an advantage in the marketplace. Gawkers. Who here never slows down when you drive by an accident? It happens, right? We're curious. So looking online is something that a lot of people do. Ideologues, people who are advancing a particular political or religious philosophy. And sometimes just mean people. There are a lot of interest in our data, a lot of interest in what we do online. And we have to protect against all of that. So back to the point, we don't have a definition of what it means to protect. We don't have measures. So it hurts us in the marketplace when we're selling things because we can't show, using a rigorous methodology and number, that a system is better than another. And therefore, it's very difficult for anyone to make a conscious decision in purchasing whether to pay extra money because it looks better. And it leaves it open to vendors and others to claim that their system is better because they can pick the definition they want that it's better by. That hurts us, and it hurts the advance of the field. It is, I think, one of the grand challenges. And 20 years ago, when I gave the talk at IU and other places, that was one of the grand challenges that has not yet been fully addressed. What we do in computer science is not strictly a science. It's really engineering for much of it. Algorithms work. Some work in cryptography. Some other kinds of work is scientific in the sense of hypothesis proof testing. But a lot of the other work that we do is engineering, and we build things. And the people who build them are fallible, and the technology is fallible. And we seek to minimize the cost. If we don't have a measure of the return, we will continue to push the cost of acquisition down. And that is one of the biggest challenges in cybersecurity that I would put forward to you if you're interested in working in this area, is how do we better capture the value proposition of security? How do we better define it so that we can talk about making those incremental improvements. A gentleman by the name of Richard Donzik, who was Secretary of the Navy at one point, among other things, I had a discussion with him, and he said that, again, the youth of the field, this is very much like the analog, it was an analog to the dialogue between Copernicus and Ptolemy. Well, they didn't have a dialogue, they lived hundreds of years apart, but the idea Ptolemy gave a model of the solar system and of the universe where everything revolved around the sun. And Copernicus, with his observations, said that wasn't right. Because after Ptolemy developed his model, observation showed that things didn't quite go in circles. And we had to make exceptions. We had to change the model a lot to account for things we observed. So you've probably heard about, Mercury's in retrograde. Well, that's because it looks like Mercury's going in one direction, then turns around, makes a circle, and goes back again. That's not circling around the Earth. That is a special case. And we kept coming up with special cases to explain the observations. Copernicus said, no, if things revolve around the sun, it all makes sense. And that was heresy. He and his followers were persecuted. Some were actually put to death for suggesting that the Earth was not at the center of the universe. But the model effectively explained real phenomenon and eventually took hold. I think that's where we are with security now, is we are using this Ptolemaic view of how to protect systems. And we continue to make patches and adjustments to make it look right. And anyone who suggests differently is very often shouted down. I had one proposal to the National Science Foundation, which I won't go into depth on, but was turned down because the reviewer's comment was, well, this is interesting, but it won't run Windows. Well, we need to have that Copernican moment where we have a new view of what security is and how we measure it and how we convey it to others. That's going to mean perhaps getting away from using existing source code, from using Windows and Linux and ARM and Intel, using IP, version 4, version 6. We may have to totally change what we think computing is if we are going to make a difference. And that's difficult because the current market favors fast introduction based on existing technology. It skews the way public sees things, because if something new is introduced that people don't know how to use, and we don't have some numbers or some justification to adopt it, it doesn't happen. We can begin to talk about environmental impact and power and some other kinds of things, but we aren't there yet. And maybe you, as the next generation, can do some of this. You have an opportunity coming because with the advent of AI and ML and the possibility of quantum computing coming, we have the opportunity to be disruptive, to be able to phrase things differently, to be able to express it differently and provide a different value proposition. But we're embracing AI, ML too quickly with its errors, with its dangers. We're not looking at responsible use. We're not looking at privacy, at intellectual property ownership, and those are all really big issues that we're going to have to deal with. But I think it's a great challenge for us as we go forward to think about that, to look at where computing is currently being used oppressively or destructively. Things like the Great Firewall of China, the use of AI in insurance company decisions, other kinds of activities, and I have a long list, but I'm sure you can think about it, where we are using the technology for things that don't empower people because we haven't defined better what the usage is. So I wanted to give you a sense of incredible technology progression. We have made incredible strides. We should be proud of our species, of our profession. We are going to be part of that continued growth. But it's going to be up to us, mostly you, because I'm getting to be an old guy. It's up to you. How are we going to define the appropriate way of doing that? How are we going to measure what appropriate is? How are we going to use that technology not to make money for a small number of people, but to make life better for all of humanity who are depending on it for communications and education and entertainment and the occasional cat video? I thank you very much for listening, and I wish you the best of luck in that mission. Thanks.
Do you have time for a couple questions?
I do.
We've got a little bit of time for some questions. I know the bell rang, but we'll only keep you here for a couple seconds longer. Anybody have a question for Professor Spafford?
So like one of the things we discussed in the beginning is that cybersecurity is like not an option, it's a requirement. And as you said, with like advancement of AI and machine learning, we have the ability to be more disruptive. But then at the same time, it would probably also be the case that like the bad people, so-called, would like be able to use AI or ML to better and faster evolve the kind of cyber threats that they pose. And like, so how exactly would that work out? Because like the way I see it, like computer science and biology, like as time is going on, increasingly the two are like, you kind of see the bigger links, such as like we have viruses in the natural world, even 1,000 years of science, and we still haven't been able to fight the common cold because like the pathogen, they continuously mutate with like each particular aspect. So
where we are right now is that we are building technology.
yeah.
And the technology can be used for good or ill. Part of our envisioning of that technology should be, how do we build it appropriately to limit some of those bad uses? Or what can we layer on as social constructs to help protect against those bad uses? One way I have talking about this is we have a lot of people who are building technology who are raised on watching Star Trek. We want to build that Star Trek future. The problem is, if you don't think through some of the difficulties, you'll end up building the Blade Runner future. Because that is an example of not having the restraints in place. It is not solely a technology problem. It is going to involve talking to the people who do politics, who do ethics, who do sociology and psychology and a wider array, and law, to talk about the bigger picture. This is cybersecurity. It's not a computing problem. It's a bigger problem. And responsible use of it is something we're going to have to better define and support. So, yeah.
All right. Right here.
It's running all up this side. You guys weren't paying attention, right?
Real quick, what exactly did you mean when you said we're not all, I guess, like on the same page or all prepared? I think when you made the joke about like Dr. Stam or other professors, not all, I don't know exactly what you meant by like, we're not all like, you know, coordinated on this front.
Well, we have had multiple definitions of what cybersecurity is over time, and we have many communities that define cybersecurity with respect to their interests, rather than something that we can apply across many different interests. So we have talked about cybersecurity as network security, computer security, trustworthy systems, reliable systems, risk management of systems, and we don't have a common view of where this is because we haven't reached that Copernican moment yet where we can actually have this integrated view. I'm hopeful that that can happen. It's just we haven't gotten to that point yet. And if we don't have that common definition, we can't have common metrics. If we don't have common metrics, then as we discuss choices with each other, we're not going from the same basis. And that's why I was saying we're not all on the same page. It creates a lot of siloed thinking.
But isn't it the job of like someone whose whole specialty is in like one niche form? Like the person who gives the overview is like an intelligence community 3-letter agency who looks at every form of security. But for an individual, like someone whose job is exclusively network, such and such, some very niche corner of network security, why should they have that top view of every form of, you know, well, what happens when this network is used by someone else who's doing some other thing? How secure is that? Is that really everyone's job?
I think awareness of and agreement of basic terms are. Your argument could be made that if you're going to go to an allergist, that allergist shouldn't know anything about infectious disease or surgery or, right? And so if you have some very obvious skin lesions, they don't know what they are. They should just be looking at your allergies. That isn't the way we try to approach a holistic protection environment. And that's, there are other examples like in law enforcement and elsewhere. They don't have to be expert on every aspect of it, but they should have an awareness to understand where their expertise fits into the overall picture and be able to know who to talk to and what to look at if they need to go beyond where their own individual expertise is. That's why you go to school here and take courses in multiple subjects, is you're not going to be hired simply to write programs in a language. You're being asked to provide informed services and information across a wide range and to learn how to learn. That's why we have a broadly based education in disciplines and generally speaking. I hope that answers your question.
All right, in the interest of time, I think I'm going to shut it down, but Professor Spafford can stick around for a little bit longer, so please help me thank him for his talk.
Thank you.
And that concludes today's cybersecurity seminar. I hope to see you at the next one.
So, Dave? So, Dave?